Hello guys, my name is Lars Stender. I'm a writer from Denmark who specializes in science fiction and fantasy stories. Today I'm here to read from my fantasy novel Mandigo and the Hellhounds. And if you want to know more about me and my work, please find me on Facebook, Lars A.R. Stender. Mandigo and the Hellhounds, Chapter 37. In the next 3 years, almost all of Mandigo's time was spent on studying and working. From early morning to noon, Montero would cram magic with him in his big library or in one of the many laboratories in the castle. In the afternoons, Mandigo would work either at building hutments for the many newly arrived dracoids that were constantly pouring in, or helping Gorgash in Bloodstone's now rather large smithy. The smithy had been expanded along with the rise in troops at Bloodstone. The soldiers needed to have weapons and armor forged, and something always needed to be repaired. And it was for that reason that Gorgas had got more helpers. Some of them were blacksmiths from villages in the valleys surrounding Bloodstone. They had either been coaxed or forced to live at Bloodstone. Some of the villagers were part of Bloodstone land, and in many cases the inhabitants were considered serfs at Bloodstone. For this reason, Montero could force them to work at the castle or for him. And if they still refused, he would send his dracoids to get the people he needed. And then there were those from faraway lands that had been arriving at Bloodstone of late. Some were recently arrived specialists, like experts in things like siege engines. Others were just slaves who had been kidnapped by Montero's dracoids. It wasn't just the smithy that had been expanded. The bakery, the slaughterhouse, and the laundry, and almost all the other sections of the fortress had been expanded as well. Besides having something to live in, the many new arrivals naturally also had to have food, drink, and clothing. Being able to provide these things required more workers and craftsmen of all sorts than the number that otherwise lived around the area where Bloodstone was situated. Since Montero was very stingy, he would at regular intervals send small platoons of dracoids out to the surrounding provinces to get craftsmen and slaves for the expansion of Bloodstone and his army. This resulted in the emergence of a small city on the terraces that had been carved out of the southern and eastern side of the plateau upon which Bloodstone was situated. But even this was not enough. Soon Montero's army was so big that the surrounding pieces of land, villages and farms under Bloodstone could no longer support the army on a daily basis. Something had to be done. Montero's solution was to send companies of his troops out on raids in other parts of the country. There they would rob and steal everything that they could get their hands on and what they considered to be useful. This included corn and cattle, chickens and poultry, hay and straw, fish and grapes, fruit and wine, eggs and vegetables, carriages and work animals, pots and pans, flax and linen, tools and rope, and, of course, all the money they could shake out of the unlucky people they encountered. In the beginning, the dracoids would only attack smaller communities and villages, but they soon felt strong enough to attack towns and even the odd city. One of the cities was named Brookhaven, and it lay south of Bloodstone and took several days to reach. But that didn't intimidate Montero's soldiers. A whole battalion of them, almost 500 dracoids, took off for the city and attacked one early morning just before sunrise. The city had defense forces, a kind of home guard, but it wasn't able to give the well-trained and ruthless dracoids any form of efficient resistance. When the sun set, Brookhaven was in flames, and those of the inhabitants who had survived the attack were led back to Bloodstone in chains to live as slaves under Montero. Montero celebrated the successful attack on Brookhaven with a great feast. The great hall was decorated with flags and garlands that seemed to float magically without any form of support or bindings, and guests arrived from distant towns and castles which Mandigo had never heard of before. At first, Mandigo couldn't fathom what these people had to do with Bloodstone or his uncle. But then Montero got up suddenly to say that the first class of initiates had now completed their training and were ready to leave Bloodstone. That would happen the next day. They would go back with a specially invited guests to live with them and in that way restore magic and order into the world. The message was received with great cheers by everyone in the hall, except for Mandigo, who kept in the background. It wasn't so hard to do, since none of the other wizards' apprentices seemed to want to have anything to do with him. Not even, or rather, especially not Casper and Jasper. Mandigo had carefully tried to talk with them at the party's start, and even though they hadn't directly turned their backs on him, it had been pretty clear that his presence made them insecure, and that they wanted him to keep his distance from them. They had both just recently become candidates and were therefore sitting closer to the place of honor. However, when Montero made his announcement, Mandigo noticed that their joy did not seem genuine. Helena didn't seem too happy either. She clapped dutifully, but her face seemed frozen. Even though her hair had grown pretty much out again, she hid it under her bonnet, and she looked pale and unwell. Hers and Mandigo's gazes met briefly for a moment across the hall, and he was deeply shaken by the sorrow and lifelessness he saw in her eyes. He also noticed the black, tight-fitting necklace she was wearing. It indicated that she had been sworn in as an initiate. So had Grimwald and his two close friends, Alamut and Tego, of Southfields. Tego had grown from the small, stocky boy Mandigo remembered when he first arrived at Bloodstone, to a strong, broad-shouldered young man with a chronically lopsided and somewhat patronizing smile on his lips. Mandigo still didn't like him after all this time. The only person who sent Mandigo a friendly smile was Sherimet, but her mother kept a constant eye on her. In honor of the evening, they were both dressed in long robes of crimson silk, their shoulders exposed, and their long black hair set up by jewel pins and barrettes made of silver and gold. The jewels flashed in the glow from the torches hanging on the walls of the hall, and the chandeliers whose magical lights could burn for hours without melting. Sherimet glowed like a dream in Mandigo's eyes, and he was constantly looking at her. Sherimet was also one of the few at Bloodstone who continued to be nice and friendly towards Mandigo. She would come out with food and refreshments to him almost every day when he was working on the construction site or at the smithy. She always smiled at him when they met, and her smile was like a shooting star in his otherwise dark horizon. She talked with him and asked about his life before he came to Bloodstone. One time she gave him a hug, and afterwards his whole body vibrated like a bowstring from which an arrow had just been shot. He loved her, and wanted only to be with her. He dreamed about her at night, and when they weren't together there would be a pain in his chest, and he could barely coordinate his limbs or concentrate on what he was supposed to be doing. After the dinner there was dancing and games. Mandigo wanted to ask Sherimet to dance with him, but was worried he might embarrass her by doing so because he was considered an outsider by the others. He was also afraid that Sherimet's mother would reject him on her daughter's behalf. Sasia was clearly preoccupied with presenting her daughter to several of the foreign and distinguished guests that had come to Bloodstone that evening. But Mandigo's heart was stronger than his insecurity. He finally built up his courage and began walking towards Sasia and Sherimet. He had reached halfway across the hall when Sasia, with an air of importance, took Sherimet's hand and led her to Grimwald's friend Alamut, who immediately went to greet them. Mandigo froze and stopped in the middle of the hall. Soon there was an empty space around him, but he hardly noticed it. He just stared over at Sherimet with a dejected look in his eyes. She smiled politely at Alamut and said something or other to him that made him laugh. The next moment she turned her head and caught sight of Mandigo. Her smile faded, and her face was both filled with an expression of surprise and sorrow that Mandigo had a hard time interpreting. Both Alamut and Sazia were now also staring at Mandigo. Alamut's lips twisted into a partially surprised and partially bewildered smile. Sazia did not smile. There was a thoughtful, but also cautionary look in her face as she studied Mandigo. For a long time, the four of them just looked at one another, and for every second that passed, Mandigo felt how the delicate, fragile ties between him and Shamit were severed one after the other. Eventually, the guests started noticing the silent episode that was being played out between Mandigo, Alamut, Shamit, and her mother. Conversations died down, and dancing stopped. An unpleasant silence slowly descended on the hall. At long last, Sazida broke the deadlock by stepping in front of her daughter and Alamut and gently directed them to the table of honor, where Madame Mortero and the guests of honor were assembled. Once she had made sure that the young couple were on their way in that direction, she turned around towards the middle of the hall to speak with Mandigo. But Mandigo had already disappeared. His defeat had chased him away like a shadow driven out by the glaring flames of torches. End of chapter.
I'm not sure I heard this one before.
You haven't?
No, I think we skipped it. I
Oh,
think that's
possibly.
actually why we don't have it.
Yeah, possibly.
Because I don't remember it.
Right. So, well, it was good you discovered it.
Yeah. Huh.
Yeah.
We're a bit further, so that's
Yeah.
why I cannot have too many questions here.
That's right. That's right.
So I think we stop it here.